We expect this to be an informal, deep, and rich conversation about whole child development, deciding what works and why. And I am going to share my screen because what would we do if we didn't have some slides to share? So I just want to make sure I'm sharing the right ones. Hang on. Okay. Okay, first question. Did I share the slides? Can you see them? Can you just see everything on my screen, my email and everything else?
Yeah, everything.
Yeah. Okay, now how about this?
Perfect.
Okay, so welcome everyone. We've been planning this session for a month or 2 months maybe, and we're really excited to have the session today. And we're going to talk today in a variety of ways about promoting whole child development, deciding what works and why. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why we decided to talk about deciding what works and why. And I'm going to start really with the field of whole child development. I think we all have an idea of what that is. Some of us probably spend our entire day and night every day thinking about this particular idea, like what is whole child development? And the world is quite interested in this concept. And here's one way of describing whole child development that comes from Porticus and is in a sense a very good representation of some of the general thinking about how we conceptualize or frame what whole child development is. As it turns out, there are lots of different ways of framing this idea and talking about it. And just to offer one definition that I think captures some of the core ideas, I took this from the Global Center for the Development of the Whole Child. And their definition of whole child development is the following. I'll just read it quickly. A whole child approach to development and learning engages a broad spectrum of support systems, including family, school, and community, to ensure children and youth reach their full potential. It equally values all aspects of a child's well-being, social, emotional, physical, intellectual, spiritual, and creative, to ensure they become active citizens and lifelong learners. And what I love about that definition and what I love about this framework right here on the left is that they represent many domains of growth and development and learning, right? So it's the whole child, it's all aspects of growth and development, and they represent different systems. So it's not just the child alone, it is the child inside an ecology. And that really, those two things are really the core of whole child development, which is multiple domains and a child inside an interconnected set of systems and supports. And so while those two cores, I would say, represent this idea of whole child development, how we talk about it and define it and conceptualize it and what we prioritize varies tremendously. And so whole child development is also known as many different things. So we hear things like holistic development. We hear a focus on aspects of development that are typically left out, but then in this case, focused on their own, like social and emotional learning. We hear things like 21st century skills, which is an effort to bring more domains into our conceptualization of what is important, but still things like systems and supports are left out, life skills, health. And then I added here at the bottom, ecological systems, settings, and context, because there's some who really focus on what's in the ecology, what are the conditions that are optimal as opposed to what are the specific aspects of development that we want to focus on. And again, across all of these ways of thinking about this big domain, we really do have these two pillars or these two cores. One is what are the multiple domains, and the other is what are the systems and supports and ecologies that are relevant. So with this multiplicity in mind, and these many ways of prioritizing, of defining, of conceptualizing this really critical idea of whole child development, how do we actually decide for each of us in our own setting with our own focus, what's important, like what to work on and what is going to work? And so we thought we would organize this session not around making recommendations about what works, but instead around how do we make decisions about what's going to work in my setting and how I'm going to conceptualize this big domain in ways that make sense here, given the values and the ideas and the needs that are present in my work and in my setting, so that I come to a decision about what is going to work most effectively here. And I have a reason for making that decision. And so in designing this session, again, instead of being prescriptive about what might work, we thought we would talk about a process for making decisions about what could work. And we are framing this session in terms of a set of key questions. This is a set of questions. It's not all the questions, but these questions we think we can use to have a conversation about making decisions about what works and why. And these kinds of questions could sit at the center of a process for any particular stakeholder to work to make decisions about what might work and why. And so that's the big overview of this session. I'm going to turn it now to Kelsey, who is going to go into a little bit more detail. And I think I should stop sharing the slides. Don't you think?
Sure. And I just wanted to double check, Ander, were you going to do
oh, right. Sorry, I'm getting the whole thing wrong.
No worries.
Yes, yes, I'm doing. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Sander. And before we step down into these critical questions, we would like to know a little bit more about all of you. I'm seeing that we have people from all over the world. And the thing we want to know is what motivated you to attend to this roundtable today. So now I'm going to ask all of you to go to menti.com and use the code we can see here in the top. And then you can answer up to three times what motivated you to attend the roundtable. And we are going to see it in a word cloud here, so we can get to know a little bit more about each other. We can do it through our cell phone or laptop or computer or even in a tablet. So we are seeing a lot of ideas. I think that the two core ideas is learning and connect, but we also can see the perspective, raising awareness, sharing and exploring with others, know new experiences, commitment to the world child development. We are also seeing the great speakers that we have in the group, the multiple perspectives, learning new research done about the topic. But as we can see, the three main of them is learn and connect, the two main of them. So I think that this is what we have. We were inspired to do the roundtable precisely about learning and connecting with each other. So I think that we are going to achieve this today. So thank you very much. Now I can pass the topic to our next presenter.
Great, and that's me. Thanks, Sander, for taking us through that. And I also am here to learn and connect from everyone who's joined. So glad that that is common among all of us. And I don't want to take too much time because I want us to get into groups to actually get some discussion going to learn and share with each other. But we wanted quickly to just sort of help guide you through our thinking and when we were discussing some of these questions and the types of topics we're hoping to discuss today. And so when we were meeting as a group to decide, what we wanted to talk about and how we wanted to frame this roundtable, we found ourselves asking things like, when it comes to social emotional learning and mental health and psychosocial well-being for displaced learners and education systems, how does anyone make decisions about what curricula, program approaches, frameworks, measurement tools, and guidance documents to use? Because there's such an array of resources available that it can sometimes be difficult and overwhelming to know what works best where you are and for the population that you're working with. And so there we then started talking about the connections between what is global and what is local and what is technically relevant. We also found ourselves recognizing that a lot of social emotional learning, or SEL, and MHPSS, or mental health and psychosocial support frameworks and programs and tools that are currently being used with displaced learners are many times rooted in frameworks and values and cultures from wealthier nations and non-displacement contexts in largely the Western global North. And so for an example, many programs and approaches are rooted in the Castle framework, which explicitly comes out of the United States. And so we know from experience that just taking a program or a framework from one context and applying it in a totally different context often doesn't work so well without significant adaptation and contextualization. And so I'm going to pause for a moment before continuing to pass it to my colleague Ula to take us through some examples that she has experienced and that many of us have experienced of challenges we've had in the field and things that maybe haven't worked so well when trying to implement SEL and MHPSS programming. So Ula, over to you.
So yeah, in fact, when we were discussing, I was trying to be critical because it's not been so long that I'm working in projects related to holistic learning and social and emotional learning specifically, and I was trying to be critical myself towards what I'm doing with teachers from displacement context. So we were working with teams of teachers. And I was always asking myself, are we doing the right thing with them or not? So we were developing material with them. And while we were doing this, I was browsing and exploring so many resources available. So as Cassie mentioned, most of the, let's say, the bite-sized activities and resources come from the US mainly context, and even though big organizations provide still resources, let's say for development contexts, most of the time they are not really adapted or, let's say, applicable and usable in the displacement and in low resource contexts. So I think, for example, of a curriculum that is created by the World Bank, which is very great and very detailed, which is called Step-by-Step STIL Curricula, where you have all the resources organized and facilitation guide and all that available. But the first thing that I noticed is that most of the time we need to have some material, at least printing some handouts for the students. And most of the time, this is not feasible for teachers who are badly paid and sometimes not paid at all to ask them to pay for printing to make any activities with their students. I'm also thinking of specifically what we call the self-awareness. This is also very critical I even lived this myself. It's very critical in let's say in trauma context or in displacement context, because children, even adults, might not react in the same way to activities that might work very well in other contexts. And one of my colleagues in Lebanon just shared a story with us before I come here. So this is really something that I added just now, about an experience of a teacher trying to apply a cell activity to improve students' understanding of emotions and help them to express themselves and their feelings in a more open way, and instead of hiding their feelings. And he started to explain how he reacts when he's scared. And it happens that his students are mostly Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And one of the children, this 5th grade class, one of the children started to remember his own experience when he was very scared back in Syria when his village was bombarded. And then he started to panic, to cry, to scream, and to throw things and objects at the other children. So instead of helping them to express themselves in a smooth way, sometimes this can disrupt them. And I can share this even for myself. Once we've been asked to think about, to have a positive mindset, to think about something that we were a place or a situation we were really very much thriving. And as a displaced myself, instead of helping this situation, instead of helping me to feel confident, for example, in a new similar situation, it reminded me of what I've lost with the displacement and put me in a very, very dire situation, not feeling well to continue the work. So these are very critical, and I think we should keep to think about them, and most of the time work with people from the community to make sure that this is really not doing any harm to the students and also the teachers, not only the students. So I'll stop here, and if you want, during the breakout rooms, I can bring more examples. I have many of them. Thank you. Over to you, Kelsey.
Thank you so much, Ula, for those really great examples and sharing your personal experience as well. And it's because of these examples and these sort of mismatches and contextual issues that many of us have seen and come across, that there are actually a lot of really great initiatives happening right now and in motion to develop country and culture and context specific SEL and MHPSS programming and well-being frameworks that are aligned with displaced community needs and values. And so recognizing that as well, we found ourselves thinking about and asking things like, how do practitioners decide whether to adapt a pre-existing framework or program or tool, or develop their own totally new and different SEL framework or tool, or a combination of both, or something completely different? And we've seen from experience that it can be very challenging to simply introduce the concept of SEL and MHPSS and well-being to a community and then let educators and other stakeholders identify their own needs and their own context and determine what skills and competencies should be included in programming and framework without some additional guidance and support. But then in thinking about that guidance and support, we found ourselves wondering who provides that guidance and support and in what form and from what sources. And so again, we found ourselves talking about things like, who are the decision makers in many of these instances? Is it local program officers? Is it international headquarters staff? Is it national education and curriculum specialists and government actors? Or is it displaced communities themselves? and whose voices are heard and prioritized in these processes and decision-making systems, and whose voices are left out and why. And also, where does the power and responsibility lie for providing guidance on these matters and supporting those who are actually working in displacement contexts? And then finally, sort of building off of what Ula mentioned, is thinking a little bit more critically and a bit more deeper about this kind of programming. How do we make sure that local stakeholders are able to look critically at programs and not just pick a program that's easily accessible and apply it in their context, without thinking through the larger social and political and power implications that that framework or that program might carry? So you can see our discussions got bigger and bigger and bigger as we sat and thought about this. And we're hoping to pick some of this apart a little bit in some breakout rooms. So I'm going to stop there and pass it over to Danielle to take us through those questions that Stephanie posed at the beginning, which are a bit more specific and a little bit more distilled than many of the larger points that I brought up. So I'll pass it over to you, Danielle.
Thank you, Kelsey, and hello, everyone. So now that we've seen sort of the larger picture, we really want to break out into smaller groups and have time to really discuss and engage and get all of your insights. So we're going to break up into 3 different groups. So the first group is going to be guided by Kelsey. She'll be facilitating. And the questions there are, what are the sources of evidence that are relevant, meaningful, and useful? But also, how does this vary by context? So just a reminder, everyone who's facilitating, don't forget to press record when we break out. Now, the second breakout group will be facilitated by Ander. And the questions there are, what are mechanisms for localizing resources that seem relevant? And how do you learn from that experience? And the third one is understanding the needs. And this will be led by Rachel. So how do systems determine what the needs are in terms of whole child development? What does that decision-making process look like? Now, our goal then is to return to the plenary, provide all of our insights, but we're also going to be discussing an overarching theme of how do we go beyond the pitfalls and assumptions of default thinking. So please keep that in mind as you're going through the discussions, so we can come back and debrief in the plenary and go from there. And Ander, if you could please assist in swiftly sending everyone on their respective ways. It is randomized, so I hope that you get a group that you enjoy. I'm sure there'll be riveting discussion in all of them.
So just before everyone disappears, I put the questions, sorry, my video stopped for some reason, in the chat. So you can have all the questions if you need them.
Thank you.
Rachel, are you able? Oh, no, she left. Okay, so welcome everyone. It looks like I will be leading this session. For those of you who do not know me, I am Kelsey. I have been working in the field of education and emergencies for the last 10 years, and I'm currently working on a doctorate focusing on social emotional learning with refugee learners in East Africa. So I'm very excited to be with you all today, and thanks so much for joining us. All right, so there are a large list of questions, or there is a large list of questions. So if there are any particular ones that individuals would like to discuss, please feel free. I'm going to kick us off though with what Danielle mentioned, which is, what are the sources of evidence that are relevant, meaningful, and useful, and how does this vary by context? So I'm going to put that in the chat just so you have that. And then I'm also going to qualify that. I'm interested to know as well, how do you and we as practitioners help local stakeholders to be critical about what is offered in their context, what is available in their context in terms of SCL and MHPSS resources and evidence? So I'm going to put that in the chat as well. And I'm going to pause there. And feel free to unmute yourself if you have thoughts that you would like to share.
I can share something, and unfortunately I have to present in a different room, different part of the world in a little bit. So I just thought I would mention Firelight. Are people familiar with Firelight and the work that they're doing? They're a fund. And I always forget if it's just Firelight or not. I'll try to look that up quickly while we're here. And they have spearheaded through their work, Firelight Fund, yeah, So they work in Southern Africa, primarily in different countries, Malawi, Zambia, and they call what they're doing community-driven change. And in the area of early childhood development, in particular, I know the age range is bigger here in the group, but they've created learning collaboratives. And so the definition, starting with the definition of what is important in the community, starts with that group of NGOs that have been chosen by people who know in the community to participate. So all the defining of the issue and then what kinds of help they might want. There's a trainer who's, I think, from Zambia. So already you have indigenous sources of knowledge in the community and also in the kind of well-trained person that's coming from the outside, but also is aware of the values. And to me, that's a very powerful start. So I would encourage people to reach out to, they have an excellent evaluation person who thinks deeply about this and very aware of the issues that were the framing for today. So just throwing that out there for any number of people at that organization.
That sounds super interesting, Jane. And I'm wondering if there's any evidence that they've generated that you know of.
The evidence is around the ways that they see themselves as having learned, or we could say failing forward, right? They didn't do it that way the first time they went out and learned a lot about why that was problematic. And then through that iterated into this model. So I think that's the most powerful evidence they have at this point. But more coming for sure.
Super interesting. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I think that speaks to kind of the second question a bit of stakeholders thinking a bit more critically, right, about what is existing in the context and working with the communities to figure out what is best and what works well. So I'm wondering if others have seen this type of model in other places, or if this is something new and could be replicable in different places.
And I should say they've been inspired by Mike Wessels and a lot of his careful thinking and writing on social emotional issues and really starting in a community way. So then they added all their agency and resources to it.
Super, thanks. Thoughts from others?
I'd even just love to hear from people in the room before I have to go of examples of missed opportunities, or when you've come across, you know, oh, this is a redo that could happen. Because I assume it's still happening where we're just transferring a tool and maybe the thing we do is translate into a language, and that may be as far as we get. Is that what people are seeing still?
Maybe share here my own experience. So it's been now more than a year that I'm working on a project where we work directly with teachers to create professional development for other teachers in their own context with displacement and but the issue is that sometimes it's not easy to explain to these teachers that they are contributors and not only beneficiaries. So this takes time. So and then this brings to the second question that Kelsey shared with us, is how to make sure that they are critical enough about what we are doing together. Because as you can guess, we don't start from scratch. There are so many resources around CEL and other holistic learning approaches that you cannot pretend that in order for you to be really contextualized that you will start from scratch. So we shared resources, and most of the time the teachers find them interesting, and they might think a little bit about their applicability, but they might not be able to think further than that. So applicability from a logistical point of view, as I've mentioned, having printouts, having small groups so that they can connect directly with the children or things like that. But more than that, they are not able, for example, to say that one specific activity is more useful here than there, or that this one that cannot be applied in specific contexts. So this is something that I noticed myself. So the teachers were really great, but I was not able to make them really critical about our group work. And this is why I'm a little bit, let's say, worried about the value of things. And we are in the pilot phase, so the pilot will bring us some feedback, but this is something very important to keep in mind, that even if we are working in local contexts, it doesn't mean that we are really local.
I think so. What's so important about what you're saying is, your first name Ula?
Yes.
Okay. That the model that we go through in our own education can dictate how we interact with other people as adults as well, in terms of showing, respect for hierarchy, or not showing them, well, whatever the opposite would be. It's not being disrespectful, but just, I made a little documentary. I'm a small funder, and it's called the Two Lilies Fund. And there's a documentary about a class of master's students that existed in Haifa, Israel, doing a child development master's program coming from their countries. And they talk about how hard it was to have a direct conversation or to challenge their professors. And I don't know if that's what you're meaning, but that you have me thinking about that.
Yeah, this is kind of related. Yeah, absolutely. And my team in Niger has the same concern, as they will be piloting with their colleagues, and as they have administrators among them, they are kind of worried about how to deal with their superiors when they are trainees for them in this let's say in this pilot.
Great. Thanks, Ula. Thanks, Jane. Miriam, I see that your hand is raised.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I also wanted to share my experience, what seems a little bit similar to what Ola just shared. However, we work remotely with the Syrian context, and because we are working remotely, this is already a layer of difficulty, let's say, we have. But instead of taking resources, translating them, implementing them, applying them the way they are meant to be applied in another language, we have decided to create our own resources. And to do that, because it was also a very new program, SEL, the way it was, we meant it to be implemented. We decided to do it gradually. So, for instance, we gave a training on what SEL is to teachers, to coaches, who then cascaded the training to teachers. But the SEL sessions are actually observed online. And every time we create a session based on what we have observed in the previous session, so that we are informed of what issues there are, what difficulties, and what works, basically. Also, and in this specific context, there are issues of space. For example, some of the SEL activities need space, but there is no space. Sometimes the space is not ideal, it's a tent. So basically, we adapt every session based on what we have observed in the previous session of SEL. And then we move gradually. We don't have a set of sessions or resources that were taken. And then we have also, what we have done is we have created a self-assessment kind of survey that the children have filled in at the beginning of this pilot project. And that hopefully at the end, they will also fill it in to give us some evidence of what worked and what didn't work and how it has impacted children. The whole process has impacted children. So we will see, we're still in the middle of this pilot process. So this is what we're doing in order not to just take something and just implement it the way it was meant for somewhere else, or for no location, specific location in the first place. So this is our approach, and so far it has been very interesting to see how the teachers have been adapting, but very cautiously, let's say, the activities that were in each session. But what is interesting is that we have had discussions after each session with the teacher who was implementing, because it's implemented in different locations, different classrooms. So, but every time it was a discussion with a specific teacher that we were observing, let's say, online, and the discussion clarified a lot of the issues that the specific teacher was facing, and also gave us clues on how we can adapt the sessions so that this specific teacher in this specific location with those specific children, because he knows them much better than we do, and we were able through this process to adapt in the following session, the actual creation of the session itself.
That's so interesting. It sounds like a very iterative process, right? And in my experience, so many times, and I myself have delivered so many SEL trainings to teachers where the modules stay the same. They are the same for everyone. And even when you deliver a refresher training, the modules are the same. You might ask about challenges and solutions and what happened in your classroom, but in reality, the content stays the same. Whereas this model seems very iterative and very much part of a learning agenda, which I think would be great to share with others.
Yes,
model works for sure, and engaging a wide range of stakeholders, right? Which it kind of gets to that piece that we talked about before of whose voices and whose perspectives are included in that decision-making process and that iterative process. And it sounds like you've really engaged a wide range of stakeholders. That's super great.
It's a continuous training for the teachers and for us, basically, because the interaction is also inspiring for us on how to continue the process. It means a lot of work because the session has to be ready for the next session and for the next week, but based on what we have seen and done. We cannot have a scope and sequence of sessions ready-made or a full training, as you mentioned, that's ready-made, it's just delivered. But it's very interesting.
Yeah. Is this in Lebanon, Mariam? In Lebanon?
Pardon?
Is it in Lebanon or?
No, we are based in Cyprus, but we work remotely with children in Syria.
In Syria?
Yeah, that's right.
Great. And Miriam, you said something there that really struck me, which is it takes a lot of work, right? And in my own research in engaging individuals who commonly like select and execute and contextualize and adapt SEL programming for displaced learners, the biggest thing that came out of my conversations with them was we don't have time and we don't have funding to put in the work that is needed to really deeply contextualize and adapt existing frameworks or develop our own frameworks. And so I'm wondering if others are coming across that same issue, recognizing it takes a lot of work to do this work. So I'm curious for anyone who hasn't spoken yet, Taofikat or Mauli, if you have anything to share or thoughts on that, and anyone else, please feel free.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. Actually,
Hi, everyone. I'm Taofikat from.
Oh, sorry. Thanks.
Fine. Go on. After you.
All right. Thank you. Yes. Actually, I do training, but currently I am on SEL facilitators course in the Emory University, and it is true that I have gotten access to this program, and I'm very interested in the children issue, and so I wanted to take advantage to participate in this program so that I can learn from the experts from the field. So actually, I do not work with children directly, so I may not be able to share practical insight as I have been hearing already from the experts from the field. So this is my background and this is my later introduction. So I am probably going to be learning a lot from you, and also so that when I I will be able to see how best we can, improve about young people's welfare when it comes to education and training. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mawuli. And if you have any thoughts related to the discussion that we've been having, feel free to share them, but I'll pass it back to Taofikat if you want to share any thoughts that you have related to the conversation we've been having.
Oh, okay. So I'm basically the director of Teenagers Guide. So I work directly with children in Nigeria. And one of the policies that have been made on displaced learning has been the Safe School Initiative, which makes it possible for teachers and parents to collaborate as co-developers in learning for children who are displaced. And even though the policy have been trying to implement online education, there have also been issues of digital divide and access. So it has been struggling, and we're trying to incorporate how that could really translate into safe school for children, especially children that live in states that have been really impacted by humanitarian crisis. And one of the things that we know is it takes steps at a time to make them feel that, okay, schools are back to functioning, especially when you hear cases of school kidnapping and all that. So that could have really been a huge part of putting fear into parents and children of not coming back to school. So the Safe School Initiative is trying to tell them that the things that will bringing in place, the policies that we're bringing in to make sure that school safe, learners can learn, and of course children can get the better of education. So yeah, I'm basically learning from everything you guys have been saying, and I'm going to be documenting them.
Okay, great, thanks. So I guess sort of going back to our discussion, we've talked a little bit about, sources and evidence and things like that. But I'm wondering if anybody has experienced taking a curriculum or a program or a framework and working with a team to think a bit more critically about the broader implications of what that program may or may not do in a community or in a school setting. So taking sort of a set of skills and competencies from one context and trying to adapt them and contextualize them for a different context. Are there ever discussions within a training group or an advisory group about the broader social, political, and power implications that implementing that kind of programming might have? Yeah, Dominic.
I used to work on a training program in South Asia, and we had some really interesting conversations about the capacity to introduce a child-centered pedagogy in a culture that didn't recognize or attach the same level of importance to student voice or youth voice that the people who'd written the program had factored in. So, if you're in a culture where children should be seen and not heard, for argument's sake, then if you're advocating for something which is very child-centered, it upsets all kinds of power dynamics in the classroom. And what the children experience in the classroom may well not be reflected in what they experience in wider society. And so you're creating dissonance or discord, which isn't necessarily going to help them actually implement the skills that the program was there. So it was a life skills or a core skills program. So it was focused on creativity and communication and critical thinking and things like that. So yeah, there was need for a really radical rethinking about how that program was framed and how it could be applied within the existing system.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me, it's things that I've come across in my own work, as well as linking back to programming that took place decades ago around gender equality and women's rights and child rights, right? When you're working with communities where a lot of these principles and values do not mesh with the community and culture and values that are there, it can result in negative effects, right? For children, for teachers, for parents. And so I had a lot of examples given to me in my own research of trainers going in and training teachers to encourage students to be more vocal in their classroom and to challenge things. But if that's not appropriate in the community or culture or the way that parents are used to interacting with their children, a child may learn these skills in a classroom and then go home and interact with a parent or a caregiver in this way, which might result in corporal punishment or violence at home, because that's not what the parents are expecting. And in their eyes, it's not appropriate. And so this then gives rise to the need for broader community and social communication about these larger social behavior change goals, right? So Miriam, I saw you unmuted. Oh, sorry, maybe that was a fluke.
I agree with you, Kirsty. The points you made were brilliant, and it's something that's happening in a Nigerian context, you know, where there's cultural and community learnings, and then you go to school and then they're questioned because that's not the way things are done to school. So yeah, I think there needs to be a synergy between parents, teachers, and students. What are we collectively learning? What are the things that we're throwing back, that we're moving forward to learn new things, and, you know, make it a collaborative sort of thing, not you know, putting a lot of pressure on the child, where they're like different kind of learning, you don't know which one to go for. Your teacher is saying something else, your parents are saying something. So yes, I really agree with that point you made.
Awesome, thank you. And it looks like our breakout room will be closing in about 40 seconds. So I just want to thank everybody for your contributions and really thoughtful comments and conversation. Yes, hopefully we can continue the conversation by connecting after this working group and after this roundtable. And so Dominic, I will rely on you when we head back to plenary to share some of the key points that we brought up.
Happily, I hope we do it justice. So please all jump in if I make any mistakes or misspeak.
Super. Thank you so much. And I'll see you guys back in the main room.
See you in the main room.
Okay.
Can everyone see the questions in the chat?
Okay, so as Daniel said, we want to discuss about the mechanisms that we can localize, use it for localize resources that seem relevant to our work, and how do we learn from that experience. So we really want to listen to you and to discuss about it.
So Ander, is this at various levels? When you talk about localizing, are we talking about at various levels, whether it's local, community, higher levels, government, or things like that? I mean, can you define that just a little bit more?
Yeah, I think it depends in the level that we are working. Because, for example, we could be in the academia working with teachers, or we could be working in a school or from an NGO, or we could be also in the local or the national government. And I think that there are different ways to localize the resources depending where we are, and we think that it could be useful for all of us to know where is everyone using or looking for those resources, so we can learn how to use it depending from our level. For example, I'm a university teacher, and I usually localize resources from the local NGOs, but also from the local government of the, not only from the city, but also from the province, which is also the capital from the country. But we have more difficulties. It's harder for us to localize resources from the Ministry of Education, which would be the first obvious option, but it's so bureaucratized that it's very hard for us to especially to find people who has the ability and the power to bring us resources.
And thank you for that, because that lead in helps me think. I've been working with 2 organizations on a local collaboration framework handbook. And what I've discovered is that you can have entities that work side by side, but they never communicate or talk to each other in any way. So collaboration doesn't occur. And when you have high stake sort of situations and you have resources that are not readily available, you have to maximize those opportunities of communication and collaboration to see how you can work together to find those resources and to be able to solve those major problems together. So I would say, right off the bat, you do have to talk and collaborate and share, and you have to develop trust. You have to be able to share your resources, and you have to be able to benefit from that and not have pride of ownership.
I'm happy to share also and just kind of get some conversation going. So we use the INEE Harvard PSS SEL toolkit. They have this wonderful resource on localizing content and programming. And it's really just a great resource because it's a set of questions that speaks to that collaboration that was just mentioned about how important it is to make sure that you're really understanding the context, but also how you can work together. So we use that as sort of like the base of when we localize. And then we work with partner NGOs or whether it be, other stakeholders to understand how our programming is going to meet whatever objectives that everyone has in common. And ensuring that the language is correct, that, the activities are culturally appropriate, all of those aspects. But those guiding questions from the toolkit help set that stage so that the content, if there's something that you haven't thought about, well, this at least, opens up to, oh, maybe we should consider this.
Yeah, if I may add, we are, Porticus is not an implementer, but we are a funder. And we can only see it from a funding perspective, but I think the approaches where we have seen most success coming out is, as Danielle and as Rose have said, where there is a strong dialogue with the partners, both on the needs, but also on the ambition. What is the ambition? What do you want to jointly achieve in the local setting? And I agree. I think it requires a discourse. You need to establish a common taxonomy. I think without that, you might really talk about different things while you use similar terms or use or talk about same things and use very different terms. And so the taxonomy, I think, is really important. And I think also to be clear on the theory of change. What are you about to accomplish? What mechanisms do you assume will work in the particular context, and be very explicit about that? And I think if there can be a strong dialogue around those issues, then I think it increases the potential for success in localization.
Hey, everybody. I'm going to throw my camera on just to say hello, but I will turn it off again because my internet connectivity isn't great. But just to add to that, I mean, everything that everyone said definitely resonates with the work that I've done. And I appreciate this point about collaboration, especially at the different levels. I think that first question, Rose, was really important because if we think about localization at the different levels, and the more we expand from the micro to the macro, I think the more opportunity or space for diversity and different views there are. So when we talk about collaboration, I also think it's important to think about what voices, collaboration, communication, what voices are being included in that, and the diversity of voices, and making sure that we have those different voices accounted for, right? So in terms of, gender and sexuality, but also ethnicity, language, etc. Language was mentioned. This is super important. And I think it's not just language, but it's conceptualization, right? There might be one word that's used in another context, but that's understood differently. So it's how that is conceptualized and understood within that context as well. Thanks.
Yeah, I can share a silly example about language, but it's actually quite meaningful. So we use a lot of yoga in our programming, but so yoga often has this context that isn't widely accepted. So we go with stretching just to make sure it's a bit more universal and it doesn't have this context. But stretching in Greece is not necessarily accepted in a classroom setting. So what we thought was very appropriate, we then learned was like, no, you can't use that. The word stretching has a bad connotation, and we had to go back and change everything to movement, which was then a little bit confusing because the kids were really not moving, they were stretching. but I mean, it's just as simple as from movement to stretching. I mean, that could really affect what you're trying to do, and just knowing that up front, and that will guide the success of the program. So language is so important.
And Sophie, I just want to kind of dovetail on what you were saying, because inclusion and diversity are so important in everything we do. And there is a population that seems to be invisible at times, and that's those children with disabilities and special needs. And so we have to keep them on the forefront so that they are included in everything that we do. And then, Ender, on your second point on how do we learn from that experience, an interesting session that I was in just right before this one had to do with lessons learned. And I think sometimes organizations are not so forthright in identifying the lessons that they've learned, which can be important because then you identify ways to improve and to do better the next time around. Because again, some of these settings are new. And so you have to learn, and you have to be able to accommodate, and you have to be flexible and agile in order to do that. So I think that's another important facet as we look at resourcing. You know, what did we do well? What can we improve upon? And let's be forthright in saying that so that we do a better job.
Rose, if I may, oh, sorry, Ander.
No, go ahead, Sophia.
Thank you. Just to add to that, and shame on me for not including disability in my example, I'm an inclusive education consultant at the World Bank, but the idea also of you know, trauma and disability especially, and not being able to speak perhaps, or not wanting to, or that just you know, adding pressure, trauma, etc. I think having different ways for people to participate in voice as well, right? So in research, we talk about like creative participatory arts-based methods or something, or different ways of them responding to a prompt, whether it's drawing a picture or acting or listening to music or an audio or something like that. So thinking about different ways of engaging voices as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Sophia. Kimberly, we would also like to know a little bit about your opinion and position.
Sorry. I kind of feel like an extreme novice right now. I'm listening to your points of view, and I don't feel that I'm up to the discourse at this moment, but I have been teaching internationally, and I'm looking at, I'm in the United States, and I'm looking at a position, or trying to find a position that works with the Afghan refugees that have come to our country all around. And I have some experience working in the Middle East, and I have some actually experience working with the Afghan community here in the United States. I don't know, way back, I don't know if this is still a true statement, but way back when I was working in California, that community was believed to be the largest community of Afghanis outside of Afghanistan. So I have that experience, and I just have a heart to go and help. So I'm trying to gather as much information so I can be appropriate and helpful and understanding when I walk into the environment, as opposed to having to learn so much. Of course, I expect to learn, but having to learn so much, I just want to walk in with something to put on the table, and that's why I'm joining. So the only thing that I would add, in my circumstance, as far as finding relevant voices, is that you may not be, because these people are all around the country. You may not be in the place that has the best voices or the most knowledgeable voices. In fact, what I'm believing is some of these people are plopped into the middle of communities that have no idea about who or what they are, or what they believed in the past, or what their life has been like. But there may be, I say local, meaning inside the country. There may be a voice inside the country someplace else, and you have to search out those voices. So for example, the Afghan Coalition in California,
for support and information and knowledge to make sure that you're addressing and, speaking to the right things on behalf of the refugees that you're working with.
Kimberly, I think you make two important points, and one is to be able to do outreach. And so we have to be active in our outreach. And the other is, I have to commend you because the human resource, I think, is really the most important in everything that we do. And so the fact that you're applying yourself as a human resource to be able to work in this field and to be able to do these things, I think is wonderful.
Thank you, Kimberly. Good luck with your search for a position. And I think that I'm seeing the situation of the Afghan population in the United States like something comparable to the situation of the Venezuelan population right now in Peru and Colombia and Ecuador. The Venezuelan exodus has moved more than 6 million Venezuelan citizens in the last 5 years. And now in Peru, we have more than 1 million of Venezuelans in the country. And there is the same issue that you have been speaking. We see a lot of communities made up of Venezuelans and some people are working for goodwill, but there are others that we don't know anything about them, and we don't know how are they making these communities and how it's working. We've seen a lot of NGOs of Venezuelans, and some of them are copying the public space about them. So it's hard for us to reach all of them, all of the NGOs and all of the communities, but I think that only if you work close with the community leaders, with the local and international NGOs, that you are able to effectively collaborate with the refugees in the country.
Thank you.
So, can you, some of you, put some examples that you have leveled, resources that you have leveled in different levels from the administration or our own work or our own institution?
I personally don't have examples. I did share a link to this really neat article about RTI and the work they did in Tanzania, where they found, where they adapted and created a kind of culturally relevant tool there. And they specifically talk about certain, certain social emotional skills that just did not apply in that context. And I found that quite interesting. I can share that link again in the chat if that would help.
Thank you, Sophia.
Andrew, do you want to start brainstorming a bit about the question leading back to the plenary to see if we can start chatting about that? Or I don't want to jump in if you had something else planned.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
So I think maybe we can start kind of thinking through how do we get beyond the pitfalls of assumptions of default thinking. So, typically when we start, thinking of what works and why, do we acquire just a program because it's available, or do we look to start our own? And so how do we move beyond sort of these assumptions? And we'd love to hear your thoughts.
I would add just, I think reflection and being reflective practitioners in our work is super important. Taking a step back, I think, especially in some of the more corporate settings where, kind of bogged down by timelines and outcomes and XYZ, but just kind of taking a step back and reflecting a bit more on, you know, how we are trying to reach our goals and how we can be kind of more inclusive or more open to outward thinking perspectives, etc. I think, yeah, reflection is super key.
I think default thinking is sort of the norm when we have done something and so we go back to it. It's just from our experience sake. The other is that crisis and emergencies seem to evolve daily and seem to be different. And so again, I go back to not only do you need to be reflective, like Sophia said, but you also need to be agile and flexible and you know, not be fearful of trying things or engaging with new you know, resources or opportunities. But it's just hard. It's like you're changing the tires on the plane as you're flying, you know, that kind of thing.
So I think this notion of agility and flexibility is so important because, you know, as crises are unfolding and they are, as Ro mentioned, they are so different. We need to make sure that we can move along as we move forward. So how does that, now going back to what we were discussing earlier, you know, as we're thinking of how do we adapt our resources to make sure that they're relevant for that particular crisis? And how do we learn from that? Because, I mean, even just in the past couple of months, we've had the Afghan crisis, now the Ukrainian crisis, like both of them are so incredibly different, but there are similarities. And how do we learn from one crisis to the next to say, okay, this worked, but perhaps this is not going to work in this other context, but we can take elements of what worked. And so is that through advocacy? Is that through sharing best practices? Is it through convening with networks like this? So I open up the floor to discussion.
I just need to add that as we look at best practices and lessons learned, and we take the best of all, that we also influence policy, because having worked at higher levels, I see where policies, laws, regulations, and the bureaucracy at different levels can impede upon successful intervention and successful, you know, resource provisions, because you run into the bureaucracy of what can you do, what are you allowed to do, et cetera. Even from a funder's perspective, I'd be interested to hear from Gerhard, you know, if you have a mission and a goal and you've been approved for funding to execute and to implement, and then you have to deviate because of, you know, maybe the circumstances or, you know, the situation, you know, how is that looked upon and how difficult is it then to navigate through that in order to satisfy those that are resourcing you to do what you need to do? That's.
Yeah, no, this is a discussion that we just had internally because we're just doing a reflection exercise. And one of the things that we came up was also how critical it is to be patient, to have time for developing relationships, time for contextualization, and the required flexibility within a stable setting. So overall, it needs a stable setting. It needs a certain commitment framework, but within that commitment framework, then you require flexibility to, first of all, to learn, and secondly, to adapt to new opportunities or to new challenges. And I mean, as a private funding, as a private philanthropy, we are in the lucky situation that we can be flexible. Our boards allow for flexibility, so that's not a challenge. But I mean, I think it's more a problem for larger bilateral donors or for international organizations to build in that flexibility and to allow for significant deviations to overall ambitions or to outcomes and outputs. But I think this is really, I mean, building up trustful relationships with partners and allowing them to be flexible, I think it can achieve a lot. I think it really allows for making inroads. where otherwise you would be stuck because there might be hurdles that you can't overcome, or even to pause for a time and step back and say, well, now there are conditions we cannot continue to operate. Let's pause and let's see when the framework conditions improve again. I think this is a flexibility that is really critical and helpful.
Thank you, Gerard, and thank you, all of you. We are closing the breakout rooms and returning to the main session so we can socialize and share all the ideas with our partners. Thank you very much.
Interests me because even before COVID, we had many collapsed systems here. We don't have a child protection system, the health system collapsed. And now, still facing the COVID pandemic, we have a collapsed education system. So what interests me about today's discussions and the group in general is systems building, how we prioritize what to do so that most of those domains that we saw earlier are covered by a strengthened system. Over.
Great, Mark. Can you choose someone to go next? And then we'll just, the next person chooses the next person and so on.
About Rajni Shrestha.
Thank you. Hi, Rachel. Hi, everyone. My name is Rajni Shrestha, and I am a project director with World Learning. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I manage our Lebanon education project called Kitabi. It's a USAID funding project that works with the ministry in 3 areas to improve reading and math outcomes, social and emotional learning, and overall system strengthening. Like Mark said, for me, I was interested in the session and just attended another one this morning just to hear everyone else's experience. These questions are really good questions. I don't know if we all have answers, but I think it'll be good to just hear everyone's experience and learn. So I'm happy to be here. I will pass it to, let's see, Sadaf. I hope I got the name correct.
Yes, you did. Thank you. So I'm Sadaf Haq. I'm with Porticus, based in Bangladesh, and I primarily look up and lead the work on education and displacement and education, early childhood development in Bangladesh, and also with the Rohingya population. And I think my interest in this whole roundtable sessions across the day is just to learn from the different experiences, from the different contexts, because as it has been kind of shared over and over in the last few hours, is that, same as any situation, I think the refugee context really matters, and the population that each partners work with varies even in the same context sometimes. So just to learn from experience and maybe share something that I have come across as well. Thank you. So I'll choose Karina.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid I joined the room slightly late, so I didn't exactly get the question prompt. So I will just use that as an excuse if my answer doesn't really make sense. So my name is Karina. I work at Salzburg Global Seminar, and together with Porticus, we're convening this roundtable today. So I'm really, really excited to be here and have all of you here. So I guess my main reason for joining and being part of this network is because I think oftentimes education displacement is sort of almost forgotten. And I think especially whole child development, it provides such a crucial tool for those children to adapt the best way they can to the situation that they're living in. And so I think making sure that students have as much access to that as possible, I think is just key really. And so I'm really excited to hear from all of you what you're going to be sharing throughout the session. Thank you. And I'm just going to scroll through the list. So maybe Sohir Nasser, I see. Maybe I can hand over to you.
She's actually writing in the chat that I think she has some issues with her microphone. And I have issues with my video. I'm sorry about that.
Can I still hand over to you, Clarita, then?
Yes.
I mean, it's a shame we don't get to see you, but
no, but you know, I'll make it work. It's just that I moved from my laptop to my desktop and something happened, but I don't want to leave the breakout room. So my name is Clarita. I am currently based in Bogotá, in Colombia. I work for Fundación Escuela Nueva. We work primarily in the rural, very isolated, multi-grade classrooms, but because those settings have required that we innovate in pedagogic practices, we were able also to adapt most of the strategies and most of our program for out of school children in displaced situations. And now more recently with the Venezuelan migration, we've adapted the program to this particular challenge and to this particular situation. So, you know, I'm part of the network because for one part, we have a lot to share of that experience, initially with internally displaced Colombians, and now with those internally displaced Colombians and migrant Venezuelan children that have come in the last years. We've been able to, with the support of UNICEF, put together a program that has been very effective in helping these children then transit into the formal educational system. So we have a lot to share, we have a lot to learn. And what I would say is one of the reasons that I joined this and I'm so interested in this dialogue is from the outset, we put at the heart of all that we do social emotional learning without even knowing that that was so important. And that's something that we did, you know, many years ago. Because we're aware of the circumstances, the realities, the challenges of these children and their families, we're absolutely convinced that every educational approach should start by working in social emotional learning and then probably academic. So it just made sense to be a part of this network and learn from all of you and exchange on our experience. And I'll get started on the camera thing so I can see you all.
Thanks.
So I would hand over probably to Marisha. Is that well pronounced?
Yes, it's Maria.
Maria.
Yeah.
Maria.
But it's common that I'm Marija or Marika or Marija, or it doesn't matter. As long as I recognize myself, it's me. Okay, I'm Maria. I'm currently in Munich. I'm originally from Serbia, but for the last 20 years, I moved for work and family reasons as well all around the world. I'm coming from higher education, actually. I'm a professor at the university and I work as a researcher as well and as a consultant. I become interested into primary and secondary education like 12 years ago when I got my first child, and how is that connected with the university level. And then the perceptive change a bit, and I moved my professional development into diversity and inclusive teaching and social emotional learning as well, but also how you embed that into traditional academic curriculum and assessment. And this is where I think most of the world is actually struggling with how to find the tangible proofs of the impact of social and emotional learning onto academic performance of students. and how to bring that into focus for leadership in every level. Is it national curriculum matter? Is it ministry? Is it leadership of the schools? Is it international schools and various programs and so on? So I'm not maybe involved, unfortunately, in a way all of you are, but I'm very interested in a topic, and this is why I'm here. And is there anybody else? Now I'm not sure. I'm sorry if
I think Sohair, but I don't know if her mic is working. Sohair?
Sohair, yeah.
If not, Sohair, you can write in the chat and then someone will read out your responses. Okay, great. So we have such a mix of experience and backgrounds in the room, which will make this conversation really interesting. So we have one key question that we're going to discuss as a group. Before I pose the question, I'm going to ask that we have a volunteer to feed back in the plenary so that you already know it's you. So preferably someone who isn't already involved in a role like Stephanie or Corinna. Do we have any volunteers to feedback our discussion? I know it's the worst. No one, no one wants to do it. No one
wants to do it. This is what people tell me in my own classes, which is that I just have to wait, and I can't wait.
I know. I'm just going to wait a little bit longer. Any volunteers?
What we could do is keep summarizing as we go along, and just one person volunteer to say the summary. Would that help?
What about that?
I mean, I'll just start with a summary of some of the things I just heard, which is two things about social emotional learning. One is that it's really important, and it's important now, in particular, that with all the disruption, it has become something that is hyper salient and is on the minds of those who have always thought about it and those who never thought about it. So it's in the conversation in a new way. Number two, about social emotional learning, there's still a challenge in communicating its role or understanding its impact or convincing those who need convincing that it is important and worth time and investment. And then the third thing I heard had to do with I'm thinking about you, Mark. How do we shift, or how do we ensure, or how might we think about building systems around individuals as opposed to things for individuals, and how could those systems reflect these ideas? So we're operating with these two concepts in mind, which is like the stuff that is important for individuals with social emotional learning as a particularly salient idea, and how do we embed that in the systems that surround and support those individuals.
Beautiful summary, Stephanie. Thank you. You're basically volunteering yourself for the plenary.
No, but I'm supposed to get everybody else to say stuff in the plenary.
Like, that's okay, thanks, cool.
I'm going to look at you, Rachel, to summarize.
Yeah. Well, I'm taking some notes, so we'll have something between us. But so the question that we thought would be great for this group to discuss is understanding needs, okay? And how do systems determine what the needs are in terms of whole child development? And then what does the decision-making process look like? So I'll just let you ponder that question for a moment, and then feel free to unmute yourself I know Rajni has a lot to share on this, which will be very interesting for the group.
Systems for us, are we saying, is the ministry? That's how we're all looking at systems. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, any systems that you're working within, really. So, you know, obviously, ideally at the ministry level for impact, but it might not be, and we're interested in hearing that.
At least here in Honduras, you know, with a lot of migration, a lot of violence, a lot of deportees, returnees, refugees, the whole package. The system, whether it's the child protection system that doesn't exist or the health system that collapsed, it's really groups like the Red Cross. It's groups with people on the ground, oftentimes doing volunteer work. Could be through religious groups, could be through the Red Cross, could be through something else. But at least from my perspective, capital city in Honduras, that's where we kind of get the quality sense of what the needs are. Because the ministries, at the end of the day, they just collect data and numbers. And of course, if there's something alarming, that also shows up and is quantifiable. But more often than not, it's groups like Red Cross and other volunteers who you just have to be in touch with them. And then the role of the capital city players is to get that info into the systems.
So it's outside actors primarily who are determining and then describing to others what the specific needs are.
Outside of the systems, but inside the reality.
Right, inside the place, outside the systems, yeah.
I could share experience from Lebanon. In Lebanon with the Kitabi program, you know, it is, I always say it as we work with the system through the system. So, you know, all of our social and emotional learning work, reading or math, everything we are doing with the ministry. And I think before we were, I forget who was saying about these SEL frameworks, you know, SEL frameworks that are developed in the Western world. You know, sometimes we just lift and try to implement in contexts like Lebanon. And we with the NYU Global Ties, we wanted to create a SEL measurement tool. You know, that was our vision. And then we realized that we didn't know what we were measuring. And then we said, okay, we have these frameworks, and then realized, oh, we have so many more frameworks. And they were all, you know, something that was in other context. And through Portico's support, we brought together the ministry, different ministry units, you know, the curriculum unit, training unit, the pedagogy and coaching unit, and went through this long process. I think it almost took 2 years to come up with a SEL framework that is very much contextualized to Lebanon. It was a long process because, you know, there's so much turnover and all of that in the ministry, at the ministry level, or, you know, with all of the different crises. But ultimately, we did come up with a SEL framework, and we had the ministry staff side by side working with us. So they were part of the workshops, you know, they were part of reviewing all of the what do you call the frameworks, and, you know, what kind of constructs and domains these frameworks address. And today, we in August of this year, the minister did officially sign off on this SEL framework that we are hoping that everybody, every institution in the country or every program, you know, looks at this framework, and it's very much contextualized to the Lebanese context. And now we are now talking to the parents, you know, interviewing, doing qualitative research with the parents and caregivers to see, you know, if whatever competencies and all that we came up with resonate with them. So, you know, how does the system determine what the needs are? You know, it's an iterative process. You know, we involve different stakeholders, from the ministry to teachers to caregivers, and the process is still going on. Kitabi in parallel did a couple of assessments. These assessments are always done with the ministry, but then our hope is that it's not an assessment just sitting with the report just sits in a drawer. We are looking at, there's a rapid needs assessment that we did where social and emotional learning came out, loud and clear. There was so much need for SEL. All of the parents said, because of the different crises, there's a need for that. So we took these findings from these assessments and made sure that we were addressing it in our interventions. But I think it's a great step towards in terms of making sure that we are being responsive to the local context through this SEL framework, because it is contextualized, and it was, like I said, it's almost 2 years worth of work, and finally now we have a framework that's been approved by the minister.
Go ahead, Clarita.
In the case of Colombia, in our experience, it's very similar to what Mark has mentioned, of local grassroots organizations, the civil society being very much at the forefront of working and determining and working with the communities, understanding their needs, understanding their realities, and therefore determining what is needed. That's there are a lot of organizations that are working on this. We are one of them. So I think we're from a very local perspective, we've been able to channel, and understand what the needs are. But we are also I think Colombia is in a privileged position in the sense that, for many years, there's been not this social emotional learning framework, but, a broader framework, if they're calling here competencias ciudadanas, which translates like citizenship competencies. And this is developed, for more than a decade. I think Colombia was one of the first countries in Latin America to actually move in this direction of talking about these things, at least, and assessing them and incorporating them into the curriculum. So the dialogue has not been that challenging, in the sense that there is an overall understanding of the importance of these particular social and emotional learning skills within this broader framework. So in that sense, the dialogue has been easy, let's say. However, it's mostly the civil society organizations which are able to more quickly, more efficiently respond and understand to the real needs of the communities. But it's been what we've been able to have this dialogue with a more institutional level, with the educational authorities at the local, at the regional, at the national level, because there is an understanding of this. There was one more thing that I wanted to mention. No, probably I'll save it for another moment. It's more relevant later. But that has been the case, at least here. Oh, no, there is one more thing probably that I could compliment, and it's because the work that we do, the ultimate goal is for children to enroll back into the educational system and restore some basic learning skills, both at the cognitive and the non-cognitive dimensions. We have to also to dialogue a lot with the schools, and the system understand at the school principal and the school leadership in the schools. But there we struggle a lot, because still the focus has been a lot on academic skills, and what grade should the student come into the school, and so there we have a disconnect from the understanding the need of this child, which is much more from a social and emotional dimension, and then trying to have this dialogue at the school level, which is of course much more interested in the academic part and the subject area part and the content parts. Are they skilled, or do they master these skills to be able to be into this grade? So there we do have sometimes a disconnect at that level.
So I from what I hear, because I'm Are we all back? More or less. I was, this is like this weird thing about Zoom, which is that it is so wonderful. in helping us get in and out of things like breakout rooms really efficiently, but then it does this thing where it cuts you off and you have like a little bit of a heart attack and you're not sure what you're doing and suddenly you're in a different place. So to my group, I apologize. I was like just about to say something to maybe help us with our summary, but we're fine. It's okay. And I'm still recovering from my heart attack here. So I think in this next part, what we hope to do was kind of hear from each group. We had 3 groups, each discussing a different question that is a key component in getting to a process for deciding what works and why, as opposed to just deciding on a thing. And in our group, we talked about determining needs, like how are needs understood, how are they determined, and who's doing it. And we heard 3 quite different models for doing that. We didn't quite get to the part that was like this. We got a little bit into the part that was about like, is there still a disconnect at some place between like determining needs and then making a decision about what to do? But we started to get into that. So we'd love to hear from each group, sort of what was the question you talked about? What did you talk about? And maybe like, you know, what do you think? So what are you thinking now about deciding what works and why? So I don't remember what group I was in, what the number was, but was there a group 1? Or does someone want to volunteer from a group to talk about what their group talked about?
Group 1 was Kelsey's group. So maybe.
I don't want to put anyone on the spot because that can be very
Yes, and we're lucky to have Dominic, who is taking notes for us. So I'll pass it over for him.
Oh, I'll put Dominic on the spot for sure.
Thanks, Stephanie.
You're on the spot.
So we used half our time to talk about sources of evidence that are relevant, meaningful, and useful, and how does this vary by context? I don't know if that was the same question that the other groups were tackling first, but we had a lot of the conversation was built around a specific case study, an organization called the Firelight Fund, who work in Southern Africa and have an approach which is focused on community-driven change, especially for early childhood. And the approach that they take is to build learning collaboratives at a community level made up of local NGOs, including Indigenous organizations, who then spend a significant amount of time working on very precise localized definitions before any intervention takes place. And that they have shared a lot of evidence about the kind of how they've reached this process and how they know it works. So they talk a lot about failing forward, but have a lot of resources around for that. Kelsey or other members of the group, is there anything you'd like to add to that section of the conversation? We then moved on to the second consideration, which was about how you help local stakeholders to be critical arbiters of what is being offered. And it's shared kind of similar experiences across different contexts about just the range of different SEL or related resources that are out there and how much work needs to be done to help with local contextualization or the applicability of different approaches for local contexts. So I shared an example of a project I used to work on in South Asia, where we were talking very much about a child-centered pedagogical approach, and it just didn't make sense in the local context where there was a very specific idea about children's place in society and the amount of importance you would attach to children's voice. And it was very clear very early on that continuing to roll out the training as we thought we would was going to create all sorts of power imbalances and just not be effective or appropriate in any way for that context. So we went through a long process of recalibration and rethinking how the resources and the approach needed to be done differently. Mariam shared a really good example of War Child's work using a wide range of different stakeholders to help shape a very iterative, continuous training approach where after each training module, there is a collective process of adaptation and evolution that helps make the following session even more culturally appropriate and contextualized. But obviously, this takes a huge amount of work. And one of the challenges that I think resonated across the group was, whilst taking the time to ground resources in specific contexts, is always time well spent. It is a huge amount of work. There often isn't funding or time to do that. I think that was something that Kelsey said had come up in her research. So it's, being open and honest and upfront about the amount of work that's going to need to go into this process is incredibly important as well. And then, many kind of variations on that type of example. So I think shared experiences around problematizing the issue and some really powerful solutions, but they do require certain funding and time considerations to be in place. And everyone else in the group, please jump in if I have misrepresented or misspoken. Great, thank you.
Okay, that's super interesting, and I'm so curious about those examples, and I hear you on the challenges. In my head, I'm thinking, wow, wouldn't that be great? How could we shift how we enter into the work so that the assumption and the expectation is not that something will happen immediately and it will change something that might be disconnected from the actual work itself, like everything in the future, for example. So what about the next group, the second group? I don't know which group that is. Could be my group, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, this could be our group. I was with Daniel and some other colleagues. And our question was, what are the mechanisms for localizing resources that seem relevant, and how do you learn from that experience? We have been speaking about how are we able to localize, and how do we work? And we have been speaking about that the main way to effective collaborate is through communication. And as Dominic said, it's a long way, and you have to work and you have to be in communication always with the agencies and the other institutions you are working with. We spoke about how important it is to understand the context you are working in, and the work of making the localization of resources at different levels. This is also interconnected with the way you are communicating with your stakeholders and your partners, but also how are you contextualizing in them in the country or the region you are. We also heard with some of our colleagues about the problem in identifying and taking being accountant, making accountability about the good ideas and the good practices you are doing in the context, but also the other people is doing in the same context, and how you have to be able to outreach in the communities, and the time you have to spend for the relations and the collaboration. I think Daniel could expand some of these ideas, or some of my colleagues in the group.
I think you covered it all very well, Ander, but in general, we just spoke of different tools also that are available and resources to help with localization, and how we could really learn from each other, and just how critical it is to understand, to focus on the collaboration aspect. So whether it be, learning from previous different crises that happened and how we can use those best practices moving forward, but I'll defer to others in the group that may have some other thoughts. And we did also touch upon the larger question for the plenary. So in how do we sort of move beyond that default assumption? And unfortunately, we know that sometimes the default is the easier. So I know that we'll speak about that later on. So I'll just keep it at that.
So I'm just, as we think about getting to that last question, which is what are the pitfalls and how do we move past them? Just a couple of keywords that are coming up in my head from all of you that seem like we could work with to think about pitfalls and moving beyond them. One is, came from the first group, which is like time and effort, and knowing what that involves is a key thing to factor in all the time. So a pitfall would be, we assume we can do things quickly, when in fact, the work itself takes time, and we have to weave that into the expectations that whomever holds for what we're doing. So that's one thing. The second thing from the second group is really this kind of robust and persistent communication across levels and in relationships. Sounds like a key thing that we want to remember. And the default would be that one group is doing the work and nobody else knows about it or something like that. That could be a pitfall. And the third I'm hearing so far is that having tools, like tools available for localizing itself, and maybe tools that draw upon or rest in prior examples. That could be a third. So, okay, now on to the next group, which I think is, in fact, the group I was in. Is that right, Rachel?
That's correct. I wonder if I'm summarizing or if anybody in my group wants to present. The silence. Okay, so I will summarize and then please just jump in. So the question we were looking at was, how do systems determine what the needs are in terms of whole child development, and what does that decision-making process look like? So we had 3 examples in our group. One was Honduras, the example being that oftentimes it's more informal, the needs assessment. It's the people directly on the ground, volunteers working right at the level of response. The Red Cross was cited as an example, who are really so close to what's going on, and that's where the needs are derived and kind of fed up the way to head office, for example. We had an example in Lebanon where there's been this huge effort by World Learning and Kitabi and NYU Global Ties to develop an SEL framework at the systems level. So working through and with the system, working at the ministry level to develop an SEL framework. And in terms of talking about that time and effort, it was mentioned that that's been 2 years in the making to develop this framework that really listens to what the needs are across all different levels of the ecosystem, speaking with parents and caregivers, speaking with teachers, speaking with the ministry. And that's a hugely iterative process. So the Lebanon example, and we have Rajni on the call, is, you know, one of these examples that we would look to say, here's what it really takes, if we're being honest. And then we heard about in Colombia, where the situation is somewhat different because they've had a competency framework at the national level for the past 10 years or so. So the entry point to the conversation is not so difficult. It's understood that these skills and competencies should be a part of the curriculum. However, there's still that leaning towards getting children back into school, re-enrolled in school, and seeing the academic process. So while you've got a very good kind of starting point, or certainly an entry point for these conversations, you can still meet that kind of tension between where should the focus be? Is it on SEL, PSS, or is it on academia? And not seeing that one kind of precedes the other. Is that a good summary? Does anyone want to add? Great.
Well, I'll just add one thing that I think is that I'm hearing all in the other groups too, which is maybe I'm saying this because I feel like it's one part of where we started, which is that there's the kinds of things that we design and we support and we think about for individuals. And then there are the systems that surround that. And there's an interest on the one hand in building systems and ensuring systems have this kind of whole child focus or emphasis or something, and an interest in building frameworks, operationalizing constructs that are focused on individuals, and that the two are always working between each other. In some of these cases, it was really about bringing the systems together to work on the problem of deciding what's going to be the focus, like what is important here and to us. And it was about, like, part of what worked was, even though it took a long time, was that the systems were working together on it. And so I just think it's important. There's a pitfall in, like, thinking only about systems or only about individuals. So bringing the two together feels like something to highlight.
Certainly. So I think, are we moving on to the next bit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the, I mean, yeah. I think what we heard was so interesting, and we could, like, talk about it for the rest of our time. And we had hoped to talk about it in a framework of, like, with these ideas in mind and these really interesting and rich examples, how could we shift thinking about some of this work? And in our small group, we framed it, as you've already heard, as like default thinking or falling into traps, to pitfalls, and like what we could say and do that would get us out of some of those pitfalls. And the pitfalls might be something like assuming that we can just adopt a framework that is close by. So, for example, if anybody is interested in social emotional learning and they Google social and emotional learning, the framework that will come up is Castle's framework. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with Castle's framework, but it is designed with particular population and systems in mind that might not be relevant or valued or appropriate in other places. So the default might be like, okay, here it is, we can adopt this and that'll make sense. The danger is that it won't make sense and the work won't be relevant or valued. So we thought we could talk about some of this process thinking by framing some pitfalls and how to move beyond them. And now anybody should feel free to jump in. Like, what might a pitfall be, or what might be a way to move beyond it?
Go ahead.
Was that to me, Rachel?
Yeah, go ahead, Dominic, yeah.
It's just kind of thinking about approaches in other areas of education that we might be able to learn from. So kind of thinking about some of the work that goes on in the open education space, and frameworks that exist for adaptation and contextualization of resources that are developed to be open ed in the first place. Because it felt, certainly, you know, in Kelsey's group, in the conversations that we were having, the two big challenges that it would be amazing to solve are funding and time, and how they're connected. So where it was possible to develop, you know, low resource frameworks or approaches that would support this kind of adaptation, that would be an amazing win for the sector. And I took part, there's an open education conference organized in Colorado each year or every other year, and they were having some really interesting conversations when I was part of it 2 years ago about frameworks and approaches and the sort of scaffolding that you can put in place around resources, whether the author of the resource is kind of able to highlight things which are core to it and kind of fundamental to its success, and then all the bits that you can pull out and chop and change.
So So drawing from other fields and considering how tools and ideas could be ported over to make some of what is what should be legitimately take time, maybe take less time.
Thank you. You said it in much less time than I did, illustrating the point.
Oh, so we have Ryder?
Yeah, I apologize. My name is Ryder Delaloy. I work with Emory University, and I apologize. I actually came in late, but what was fascinating is that I must have timed it perfectly because I came in as everybody was sharing their synthesis. So there's kind of an objectivity that I bring, maybe just because I just heard the sound bites. But anyways, thank you for allowing me to be here. The question of adaptation is a really challenging one that we grapple with on a regular basis, given that we work with affiliates from around the world. And, I use this adage, and I think I need to come up with a new shtick, but what works in South Korea does not work in South Africa. And much of that has just been by making mistakes. One of the things that I think is important is language and how language is used. The other one that we've worked and looked at explicitly is policy is guiding and driving much of that language. And so as you look at the ways in which countries are coming on board with both national policy, for example, we were working with Mongolia and India, you're seeing overtures towards this language. But one of the fundamental issues that I'm grappling with, and I just want to put out to this group, was much of social emotional learning is predicated on constructivist education or student-centered learning. Yet many of these places that are bringing that on, that's almost antithetical. People teach like they were taught, and they administer schools like they were administered, And so in that way, there's this through line of helping to also address that pedagogical shift, because I can't teach self-compassion by just listing out like, here are the dimensions of self-compassion and now recite it back to me. You've got to feel that. And so, the one thing I want to kind of hone in on is just also, as we talk about whole child development, are we also simultaneously having the conversation about whole adult development? Because that is the one vestige of CASEL that I do agree with. And having failed in implementing SEL in districts I've worked in, is until you cross that divide and teachers can see themselves reflected in this, it's not going to happen. And I want to put that out there. And then to Dominic's point, just to kind of riff off of that just briefly, was I agree with you. When we look at, the programming that you have regarding sustainability, why are people not acting to align their values with sustainability? I think many of those latent things regarding SEL, do they have the courage to act with that? Do they have the personal resilience not to get checked out? Do they have the tools and inner resources for the demonstration of compassion? And so there's relationships here that we could work with so that it's not another thing to add on people's already full plates, but it truly is a holistic, integrated approach. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes. Yep, I agree. But just to call out a few words that we need to remember as we think about pitfalls are sort of the assumptions that lie in language, and some of the assumptions about who's relevant and who's involved and who's the point of intervention. Taking adults seriously is part of that. And then, are there existing resources that can be leveraged? Doesn't have to be all new. I think that's part of what you were saying. I'm sure that's not quite exactly it. Gerhard.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, I think, you cannot, of course, implement the SEL or PSS approaches without localization. I think that is always a necessity, a basic necessity. At the same time, I think we have to recognize that there are approaches by some international actors that, based on initial evidence, it seemed to work quite well across different contexts and across different settings. So I think an equally important question, similar to localization, is, we need to find out what are the core elements of certain approaches. How do they work, basically? What are the underlying theories of change? What are the essentials about the program implementation quality? that seemingly make them successful or at least reasonably functional across different contexts. So I think this is also a question that is equally important as localization itself.
So adding to the need for localization is the need to find or understand using some kind of process the common elements of effective approaches that are effective in multiple places. I agree. But Miriam.
Yes, I also wanted to mention that in our programming, we have PSS activities, interventions, and in order not to duplicate them, let's say, in our SEL, we tend to separate. And this is something that we don't find in many frameworks. How do we separate PSS from SEL so that we don't have, let's say, the same competencies repeated in the classroom as SEL activities? So what we do is that we add to the, let's say, CASEL framework, the 5 core competencies. We've added a competency which is specifically what we focus on in SEL interventions. And it is what I like to call the L in SEL, because we focus on then the executive functioning, the development of the brain. So in our programming, PSS paves the way for SEL. So we start with the PSS interventions that, let's say, focus on the 5 core competencies of CASEL, let's say, framework. And then in the SEL activities, we focus on this 6th competency that I just mentioned. So this is another pitfall of just taking a framework and just using it as it is without thinking of what it means for the actual context and the actual, how to adapt it to the needs, basically.
And also adapted to what's already happening. It sounds like you're also saying that there are ways to think about what's relevant and not already being done via another initiative or approach or framework.
Absolutely, yeah.
Kelsey.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of, as I'm thinking of all of these different strands that everybody is mentioning, something I wrote in the chat earlier, but also just wanted to build upon it. I think one of the pitfalls that we often fall into, particularly when it comes to rapid onset displacement situations, practitioners are just grabbing at whatever might be useful and helpful and free and cost-effective and easily maneuverable, which then we just start replicating that cycle of picking something out of the air, trying to apply it with little time and funding to actually contextualize and adapt. And then as situations turn into long-term protracted situations, the programming doesn't change, right? It just keeps sort of rolling out the way that it initially had. And I think so many of the conversations we're having, particularly what Ryder brought up and what others brought up, of we have to think about this type of programming in a much larger social ecological way that takes into consideration historical educational systemic policies and changes, the ways that people have learned how to learn, the way that people generate knowledge, the way that people have learned how to teach. That takes a long time to understand and integrate into the process of developing and rolling out SEL programming. So throwing it out there, trying to get away from the pitfall of assuming that SEL is necessary and should be included in a rapid onset emergency response might be something we want to get away from as a field. There are many great psychosocial MHPSS resources out there to be used in immediate onset emergencies, but SEL is still new, and there might be kernels here and there that I know have been tested and might work, but this broader idea of really integrating SEL more deeply in communities, maybe that's something for protracted displacement settings and much larger situations. So yeah, just a thought there.
Well, I mean, I think that points to a big issue in the field of SEL, which is what are we expecting of it and what is it? So those two things are kind of happening at the same time, which is that it is understood to be many different things. It's understood to be psychosocial support in some places, and it is understood to be a tool for acute response in some places, and in others it's understood to be a universal, population-wide necessity that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate in an acute situation. So what is it and what do we expect of it? These are things that are often ill-defined, and as we know, so the pitfall is persisting with this poor definition. The opportunity is to demand some clarity, like what is it defined as and what are its expectations? Ryder, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, if that's okay. Thank you. This may be a little uncouth or just harsh, so I apologize. I'm just preface what I'm about to say with that, just knowing that I may stumble on this one, but the intention is good. The coming in of the kind of the savior complex that we're going to fix you, or I'm going to, I'm going to give you what you need, and I'm going to, I've got this authority to place that upon you, is another dimension of just kind of self-reflexive, what is one's motivation and how do we assume responsibility for how we go about that? I agree that there's a broader issue in terms of, and I grappled with this in my early work of sustainability education, but the way in which SEL is being co-opted, and that reference that I made to those policy doctrines that are coming out, that is absolutely happening. I just had a call with a Mexico affiliate, and they said, look, depending on one political party that comes in and the next one that comes in, it's going to shape this and frame it significantly. And so how we navigate that dangerous place of political co-optation is really important, because we're seeing that play out in the American context right now and could easily play out in other contexts if we're not vigilant with that. But the other thing, to your point, Kelsey, that really struck a chord with me is we have a tendency to make things way more complicated than they are in academia. And when my wife's a teacher, I was a teacher. When we connect on a very basic level with human dignity and kindness and fostering relationship, SEL is what we do. It's who we are fundamentally. And so for me, the ways in which SEL is shaping is, can we get consistent on it? Can we help those develop these structures and supports so that everybody receives it? But yet I don't have a response in terms of the way in which it shapes out and what that looks like. But there's something kind of essential or enduring to this work that all schools need, because I think it's fundamental to the work of education.
Rachel.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, Ryder, because there's so much conversation around how you introduce SEL or PSS to different communities and to teachers. But as you say, in our interactions, we do these things all the time, where we practice these skills to a certain extent. And sometimes when we go in presenting SEL or 21st century skills, or however it might be packaged, you kind of confuse things, and people question what it is that they are already doing naturally, instead of helping them identify what they do already, and so that it can be recreated, so that everybody's doing something similar, so that it's not just teachers who aren't naturally inclined towards that do it. But yeah, just wanted to say that
is a real tension, right? So there's the admonition that work in SEL must be explicit, right? That we need to be clear about what it is and what it looks like and what we're doing to foster it, so it has a place in the system. On the other end, it is deeply personal. It is deeply everything. So being explicit about that is almost untenable. So I think that is why we are always grappling with these things. So because those two realities exist about this very important field. So I think we have 4 minutes left. Rachel, in my notes, I have you listed here. But I mean, maybe it would be useful to talk about what we'd like to do with all of this information and these incredibly useful comments that everyone has made.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. What are our next steps for this kind of one-off session when we have, you know, we've had raised some excellent points, but how do we take that into our work, I think. And I suppose one of the ways that I'd imagined we could do that is by, I mean, and this is kind of more homework for everybody because we've run out of time, but to develop a question essentially for yourself that as you're doing your work, it's this kind of disruptive question that makes you move beyond these pitfalls that we've talked about. And for everybody, that's going to be different because we have different roles, we can influence in different ways. But we have so many of these conversations where we're very good at identifying what the issues are, and sometimes we can come up with solutions. But as it was mentioned, I can't remember who mentioned it, we often go to the easiest thing or the thing that's just within our practice. So the kind of, I hope what the takeaway could be from this is your homework. I just expect that you do it. I have no way of following up, or maybe Dominic does. But to develop a question or a couple of questions that's in your process that it just makes you think, okay, I'm not gonna just do what I normally do here, but I'm gonna remember this conversation that we had. I'm gonna take a bit more time to think about this. Because we do have, you know, on this call, all of us have influence and power in our roles and in our organizations and in what we do. And so, you know, the change that we want to see can come from us in our own roles having these kind of conversations. So just thinking about where we take this conversation into our work.
And I think we want to create a brief. Is that right? That has something in it that's like this, you know, that outlines some of these ideas about default thinking and what options are to shift that, and some illustrations, something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
So we have 1 minute. Any last words from anybody in the working group?
I think just a big thank you to everyone for everyone's participation and contribution today. It was a great discussion.
Yes, thank you all very much. I have many notes written down that I'm going to take photos of, and then I'll send them to Rachel.
Thanks.
No, I'm just kidding. I don't know what I'm going to do with them.
No, you can. I'll type them up. Thank you so much.
Thank
everyone.
you all so much. I'm sure that anybody on the group would be willing to be in touch should there be a question or an interest.
Thanks to Dominic and the facilitators.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. We have one more round table in the program today, starting in 30 minutes. So if you're interested in being part of that, you're very welcome to join. It's still possible to register for it. Yeah, and thank you very much, Kelsey,
Thanks, everyone.
Rachel, Stephanie,
Thanks,
Danielle,
everyone.
Mariam,
Thank you, everyone.
who spoke.
Bye.
Thank you all. Take care.